Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce saw when he glanced at Elena Martinez folding hospital linens in the supply room at St. Michael's in Norfolk. Methodical hands. Generic scrubs. The kind of employee you forget the moment you pass her in the hallway. He didn't see the hands that had performed field surgery under Taliban fire with nothing but a scalpel and morphine. He didn't see the calluses on her palms from carrying a 200-pound Marine commander 3 miles through the Hindu Kush with rounds snapping past her head. He didn't see the angel of the Kush standing 6 feet away, folding blue fabric with the precision of someone who'd spent 2 decades turning chaos into order under the worst possible circumstances. Elena's fingers worked the corners of each linen sheet with practiced efficiency, hospital corners, military tight, each fold exactly squared. The supply room smelled of bleach and industrial detergent, the kind of clean that made everything else feel possible. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song above her, and she didn't look up when Dr. Pierce walked past the open doorway. She had learned 3 months ago that invisibility was a tactical advantage. The less he noticed her, the longer her cover held. The longer she could monitor Commander Garrett in room 412 without drawing attention to the fact that she'd taken a nursing position at a Virginia military hospital specifically to watch over a man she'd carried bleeding through a war zone 5 years ago. The sheets stacked in perfect piles on the metal cart beside her. White. Crisp. Institutional. She could fold these linens in her sleep. Her hands moved while her mind remained elsewhere, tracking the vital signs she'd documented an hour ago. Garrett's heart rate elevated. O2 saturation declining. The morphine drip she'd adjusted at 1800 hours was buying time but not much. Maybe 3 days. Maybe 4 if the pneumonia didn't accelerate. Maybe less if nobody understood what was really happening to his lungs. She'd memorized his entire chart within the first week of her assignment. Age 51. Decorated Marine. 3 tours in the same theater where she'd served. Command-level tactical experience. And something else, something that made the Pentagon care enough to hide a classified asset in a cardiac nursing position at a civilian hospital. She didn't know what Garrett was anymore. She only knew what he'd been, her commanding officer. The man who tattooed her name across his forearm in Kandahar as a promise that he'd remember her if she didn't come back. The man who couldn't remember her name at all now, who stared through her with morphine-dulled eyes every time she entered his room. Elena folded the last sheet and placed it on the stack. 7 of them. 7 beds worth of linens. 7 hospital rooms. The number 7 would become significant in ways she couldn't predict yet, but her instincts, honed by decades of battlefield experience, told her that this number would matter before the week ended. She straightened the cart, her left leg bearing weight slightly off vertical. Old injury. Shrapnel from a roadside IED in Logar Province, 2019. The limp was intentional. It made her seem vulnerable. It made her seem like the kind of nurse people overlooked, the kind who stayed late because she had nowhere else to be, the kind nobody would think twice about when they needed someone unremarkable. She left the supply room and moved down the cardiac unit corridor, the wheels of the linen cart squeaking softly against the polished tile floor. The hospital hummed around her in that peculiar rhythm of 1900 hours, dinner trays moving through the hallways, visiting hours winding down, night shift nurses arriving to relieve day staff. Elena passed the nursing station without breaking stride. She didn't need to speak to anyone. She knew every protocol by heart. She'd trained more nurses than most people had met in their entire lives. Room for 12 was 3 doors down on the left. Commander Garrett lay in the center bed, his hospital gown hanging loose on a frame that had once carried 190 pounds of muscle and command authority. He'd lost 30 pounds in the last 6 weeks. The pneumonia was eating him from the inside. Elena could see it in the slight blue tint at his fingernail beds, the shallow breathing pattern, the way his chest barely moved with each respiration. She wheeled the clean linens into his room and began replacing the soiled sheets without speaking. Garrett's wife had left an hour ago. He was alone now, sedated, his eyes tracking nothing. Elena worked methodically. She'd done this thousands of times, the muscle memory so complete that her body performed the task while her mind stayed sharp. 12-degree angle for the hospital corner. Smooth fabric. No wrinkles. No discomfort. She adjusted his full line, a standard saline drip for hydration, and checked the morphine pump. The dosage was adequate. More than adequate. He was comfortable. That was what mattered now. On the bedside table sat a photograph in a simple metal frame. A Marine unit photo from Helmand Province, 2019. 23 men in desert camouflage, standing in the dust with their rifles at port arms. Garrett was in the third row, dark-eyed and severe, the bearing of a combat commander evident even in a still image. Elena didn't look at the photo for more than a second. She couldn't afford that kind of distraction. But her hand moved to the inside of her jacket where the faded unit patch was sewn into the lining. 2nd Battalion. Her battalion. The patch was worn nearly white from 5 years of being touched, held, pressed against her ribs during moments when composure was everything. The fabric was spotted with Garrett's blood from the day she'd extracted him under fire. She pulled her hand away and finished adjusting his blankets. His file was waiting for her at the nursing station. Elena pulled it from the slot and moved to the computer terminal in the corner, away from the main desk where the other nurses worked. She logged in with her credentials, Elena M. Torres, RN, St. Michael's Cardiac Unit, and opened Garrett's electronic chart. The numbers told the story if you knew how to read them. Troponin levels elevated. B-type natriuretic peptide climbing. Ejection fraction declining. The heart was giving up. That wasn't the concern. The concern was the notation in the physician's orders from Dr. Pierce, dated 2 weeks ago. Aggressive care measures withdrawn per patient request, the note read. Comfort care protocol initiated. DNR status established. Palliative care consultation completed. Elena's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She knew what this meant. Garrett had filled out paperwork. He decided, or been told by someone, that his life wasn't worth fighting for anymore. But the orders had been written by Dr. Pierce, and Pierce had signed off without appropriate specialist consultation. The cardiology notes weren't in the chart. The pulmonary physician had documented a single visit 15 days ago and hadn't been back since. That was unusual. That was wrong. She scrolled through the medication list. The standard heart failure drugs were there, lisinopril, metoprolol, furosemide. But something was missing. The dosages were light. Lighter than protocol recommended for a man with Garrett's ejection fraction. Elena made a note on a scrap of paper with the specific numbers, EF 32%. Creatinine 1.9. BNP 584. She folded the paper into her pocket. She'd need to examine the reasoning behind these decisions. She'd need to understand why a decorated Marine commander was being managed toward palliative care instead of active treatment. But that wasn't her decision to make. Not yet. Not until she understood what game was being played. Elena finished her review and closed the chart. She moved back through the unit, checking 4 lines, confirming medication administration times, performing the invisible work that kept the cardiac floor functioning. The other nurses moved around her like water around stone. She was present but inconsequential, a body performing tasks without personality or significance. This was exactly what she needed. Invisibility was protection. Invisibility meant nobody would question her access to patient charts or her presence outside certain rooms. Invisibility meant she could do her job without complicating the mission. At 19:30 hours, Dr. Pierce arrived for evening rounds. Elena recognized the sound of his Italian leather shoes before she saw him, expensive, hand-polished, the kind of footwear that announced status and resources. He was tall, mid-50s, with the kind of tan that spoke of Caribbean vacations and hours at expensive resorts. His cufflinks caught the light as he consulted a tablet, his expression one of practiced authority. He didn't notice Elena placing fresh water pitchers in patient rooms. He didn't acknowledge her presence in the slightest. But she noticed the moment his eyes landed on Garrett's chart. She was 2 rooms away, adjusting vital sign monitors, and she saw his shoulders tense. She saw him pull up the billing codes for Garrett's account. She watched his jaw clench in a way that suggested he'd found something unexpected. His fingers flew across the tablet screen, his expression darkening incrementally with each notation he reviewed. Elena's hands continued their work, but her attention was entirely focused on the man standing at the nursing station. Something in his posture had changed. Something in the way he gripped the tablet. She'd seen combat officers wear this expression before, and it never meant anything good. Pierce was a cardiologist, not a surgeon. His power came from credentials and institutional authority, not from the kind of field competence that came from actual emergency conditions. But something in the way he studied Garrett's account suggested that his concern had shifted from medicine to something else entirely. She couldn't tell what. Not yet. But she could feel the temperature in the room change the way prey animals can sense a predator downwind. What she didn't know was that Dr. Pierce had spent the last 6 weeks running fraudulent billing codes on the VA patients assigned to the cardiac unit. What she didn't know was that every notation in Garrett's chart, every medication adjustment, every palliative care order had been designed to generate billable events that would fund Pierce's lake house renovation in the Outer Banks and the next year's medical conference schedule in Europe. What she didn't know was that Elena's meticulous attention to detail, the way she read charts, the way she tracked dosages, the way she'd noticed the discrepancies between standard protocol and the orders Pierce was writing, was about to make her the most dangerous person on his unit. Elena finished her medication rounds at 2,100 hours and clocked out for the night. She walked through the parking lot toward the employee section, her leg favoring slightly as it always did, and she didn't see Pierce watching from the third-floor window of his office. She didn't see the way his hand clenched into a fist as she disappeared into the darkness. She didn't know that his quiet campaign against her had already begun, a campaign that would accelerate with every shift she worked, every chart she reviewed, every moment she spent close to Commander Garrett's room. But her instincts told her something was wrong. The kind of instinct that had kept her alive in the Hindu Kush. The kind of instinct that had taught her that the most dangerous enemies were the ones you couldn't see coming, the ones who operated through systems and institutions instead of direct violence. And as she drove back to her small apartment overlooking the Elizabeth River, Elena pulled out her phone and made a call to a number that was classified, a number that only a handful of people in the military had memorized. "It's Angel," she said when the line connected. "Status on the asset." The voice on the other end was crisp, military, without inflection. "Stable. Medical team notified of deterioration. Any complications?" "Civilian physician may be compromising care," Elena said. "Request authorization to assess situation." There was a pause. Then, authorized. "Report any findings immediately. Do not compromise cover." She ended the call and drove in silence, thinking about unit patches and blood-spotted fabric, thinking about a Marine commander who couldn't remember her name, thinking about the way Dr. Pierce's jaw had clenched at the nursing station. Something was going to happen. Her job was to make sure that when it did, Commander Garrett survived it. Dr. Pierce entered Commander Garrett's room at 14:19 hours, his presence filling the space like a storm rolling into a confined corridor. Elena stood beside the cardiac monitor, checking the chest tube drainage, amber fluid, normal output, consistent with day 3 post-operative. Garrett's wife, Sarah, sat in the chair beside the bed, her hands folded in her lap, worry etched into the lines around her eyes. She'd been there since dawn, watching her husband's chest rise and fall with the ventilator's mechanical precision. "Ms. Martinez," Pierce said, holding up a chart with the casual confidence of a man who'd never been questioned. "Explain these charting errors to Mrs. Garrett." Elena didn't turn from the monitor. She continued her assessment, heart rate stable, oxygen saturation 97% on the current settings, all vitals within normal range. Her hands moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd performed these checks 10,000 times before. "There are no errors, Doctor." Pierce stepped closer, his voice rising just enough for the hallway nurses to hear. "You documented a blood pressure reading at 1,420 hours. You weren't even on the unit at 1420. He turned to Sarah, his expression grave, his tone dripping with concern that felt rehearsed. "This is the caliber of care your husband receives when I'm not personally supervising." Sloppy. Dangerous. A man in Commander Garrett's condition can't afford sloppy. Sarah's face went pale. She looked at Garrett, unconscious and sedated, then back at Elena with sudden doubt blooming in her expression. Elena's jaw clenched imperceptibly, just the slightest tightening at the angle of her face, a micro-expression that someone untrained would have missed entirely. But it was all the emotion she allowed herself. When she spoke, her voice remained level, professional, each word placed with the precision of a sniper calculating windage. I was on the unit at 1,420 hours. The timestamp is accurate. Perhaps our little clipboard nurse needs a refresher on basic documentation, Pierce said, smiling at Sarah with the warmth of a predator offering comfort. It happens. Experience gaps. Elena finished the chest tube assessment, recorded the output in the chart with steady handwriting, and said nothing. She moved to check Garrett's medications, morphine drip running at 4 milligrams per hour, propofol sedation stable, antibiotic regimen intact. Everything correct. Everything by protocol. Her movements were unhurried, methodical, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. Pierce lingered, watching her work, waiting for her to break eye contact or defend herself. When she didn't, he left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway with the satisfied cadence of a man who believed he'd won. Sarah's voice was small. Did you make a mistake? Elena set down her pen and looked at Garrett's wife, really looked at her, the worry etched into the creases around her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as they gripped the armrest. No, Elena said quietly. I didn't. It wasn't a request for belief. It was a statement of fact. Sarah nodded slowly, uncertainty still lingering in her expression, but something in Elena's delivery, the absolute absence of doubt, the steady eye contact, the voice that carried the weight of immovable stone, seemed to settle her. 1 hour later, Elena entered the break room with her meal tray. The room smelled of burnt coffee and the sharp antiseptic tang of hand sanitizer that never quite washed away the hospital's pervasive staleness. 3 nurses sat at the center table, Jennifer from night shift who'd offered to trade shifts twice, Marcus who'd shown her the locker combination, Beth who'd brought her coffee on her first day when no one else had bothered. The moment Elena pulled out the corner chair, Jennifer stood abruptly. The chair's legs scraped against the linoleum with a sound like a siren, loud, deliberate, unmistakable. We should check on the post-ops, she said, not meeting Elena's eyes. Marcus and Beth rose in synchronization, their movements coordinated with the precision of a formation, leaving coffee cups half full, steam still rising from the dark liquid inside. The break room door swung shut behind them. Elena sat alone in the sudden silence, her meal tray untouched in front of her, a turkey sandwich, an apple, a yogurt cup that sweated against the plastic plate. She picked up the fork and began eating methodically, her face showing nothing, no hurt, no anger, no surprise. Just the professional composure of someone performing a necessary task. Though her hand did pause for a fractional moment before lifting the fork, a hesitation so brief it would have been invisible to anyone watching from outside the room. But no one was watching. No one was ever watching. By the morning shift change at 6 o'clock hours, the unit board was papered like a wall in an evidence locker. Elena approached to retrieve her assignment, and the other staff members parted around her like she was contagious, their conversations dropping to whispers that followed her movement. The notices covered nearly half the board, each one bearing her name in Pierce's careful handwriting. Martinez, medication documentation incomplete. Martinez, failure to follow chain of command. Martinez, insubordination during rounds. Martinez, unsafe charting practices. Martinez, lack of clinical judgment. Elena read each one, her eye scanning the fabricated accusations with the analytical distance of someone reviewing a tactical report. The notices were placed in a specific pattern, escalating severity, each one positioned to be seen first by whoever checked the board. Coordinated. Strategic. Designed to build a narrative of incompetence before any formal inquiry began. 15 staff members stood in a loose cluster, pretending not to watch her. Pretending not to see her reading the accusations that bore her name. Pierce arrived at 6:15 hours, his voice carrying across the unit with surgical precision. I've requested a formal review of your credentials, Martinez. We can't have liabilities working critical care. Not on my watch. Elena finished reading the final notice, then took her assignment sheet from the board without a word. Her movements remained measured, her pace steady. She walked toward Garrett's room with the same unhurried stride she always used, the kind of composure that comes from training that goes bone deep. The other nurses watched her disappear around the corner. Some made notes. Some looked away. None of them stepped forward. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came that evening at 19:30 hours when Elena was cross-referencing Garrett's chart against the VA reimbursement codes as part of her cover mission, a routine audit that was supposed to attract no attention. She found it almost immediately. A medication billing code for lidocaine infusion at 1,420 hours on August 14, the exact timestamp Pierce claimed she'd fabricated. Except there was no lidocaine infusion ordered. No clinical reason for one. The code appeared on Garrett's chart, but nowhere in his actual medical record. She dug deeper, pulling records for the other 11 VA patients under Pierce's supervision over the past 8 months. Everyone showed similar patterns. Inflated procedure codes. Phantom medications. Surgeries billed but not performed. The money trail led to consulting fees, conference reimbursements, equipment purchases that never arrived. $340,000. Systematically structured. Carefully disguised. The work of someone competent enough to hide it, but not competent enough to account for every discrepancy. Elena photographed the documents with her phone, uploaded them to a secure encrypted server, and immediately understood what this meant. Her cover mission, the reason she'd taken this nursing position, the reason she was here watching Garrett at all, was about to collapse. At 8 p.m. hours, Pierce issued the reassignment order. Elena to orthopedics. Effective immediately. No explanation. No discussion. Just 4 words, you're being reassigned, Martinez. Elena requested cardiac ICU assignment be maintained per her original staffing agreement. Pierce denied it with the casual cruelty of a man who'd already calculated every consequence and found them acceptable. Your performance has been unsatisfactory. You're moving. She returned to her locker that evening and stared at the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one Garrett had given her in the Hindu Kush, still spotted with his blood from the firefight where she'd carried him 3 miles under enemy fire. That patch represented something that couldn't be compromised, the operational mission to monitor an intelligence asset, to keep him alive, to ensure his classified knowledge remained secure. Reassignment meant she couldn't monitor him. Reassignment meant Pierce's altered medication protocols would go unchecked. Reassignment meant failure. At 10 p.m. hours, Garrett's cardiac monitor began showing increasing arrhythmia. Elena reviewed his chart from the orthopedic floor. She still had access, still checked him obsessively, and saw that Pierce had changed his medication protocol. The dosage adjustment made no clinical sense. It was designed to destabilize, to accelerate his decline. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't follow the chain of command. She returned to the cardiac ICU and found Pierce in the hallway outside Garrett's room, reviewing another chart with the focused intensity of a predator. "You're not authorized on this floor," he said before she could speak. Elena met his eyes. When she did, something shifted in her posture, subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to anyone trained to read the language of bodies under pressure. Commander Garrett's protocol was altered without cardiology consult. That's not standard of care. Pierce stepped closer, close enough that Elena could smell the expensive cologne that masked the sweat of a man who knew he was being discovered. "Leave now, or I call security and you're terminated tonight. Those are your options, Martinez." Garrett's cardiac monitor alarm screamed code blue, a sound like a siren that cut through the hallway and made every nerve-ending fire at once. The ventilator's alarm joined the chorus, and the overhead intercom crackled, "Code blue, cardiac ICU, Bay 4. Code blue, all cardiac personnel." Pierce's face went blank. Elena moved toward Garrett's room without hesitation, without waiting for permission or authorization. Behind her, she heard Pierce's phone ring. She heard him answer. She heard him say something about liability and security. But those sounds belonged to the world she was leaving behind. The billing audit should have been routine. Elena sat in the basement records room at St. Michael's, the fluorescent panels casting everything in a sickly green wash, and pulled Commander Garrett's chart alongside the VA reimbursement files. Cost accounting reports lay spread across the metal table like evidence at a crime scene. She'd done this 100 times during her deployments, reconciling field medical logs with supply requisitions. The methodology was identical. Only the stakes were different. The columns didn't match. They shouldn't have, but they did, perfectly, suspiciously, in ways that made her stomach tighten. Garrett's chart showed 4 separate ICU days billed at maximum complexity codes, level 5, critical care, each day flagged as requiring intensive physician involvement, advanced diagnostics, and specialized procedures. Elena cross-referenced the actual documentation in his medical record. 2 of those days, she'd been his primary nurse. She knew what had happened. Routine vital sign monitoring. Standard medication administration. 1 diagnostic ultrasound. Nothing close to level 5 acuity. Nothing close to critical care billing codes. She traced the authorizations backward. Every inflated code bore Dr. Pierce's digital signature. The pattern repeated across 3 other patients. Then 6 more. All VA cases. All recent admissions. All showing phantom procedures listed in the billing codes that never appeared in the clinical documentation. A lumbar puncture that hadn't happened. A transesophageal echocardiogram billed but not performed. Advanced imaging studies that existed only in the reimbursement ledger. Each one representing thousands of dollars flowing from the Veterans Administration directly to St. Michael's, which would then process payments to providers listed as attending physicians. Elena's hands remained steady as she photographed the documents with the encrypted phone she carried under her scrubs. Hands that had held lives together. Hands that had field-dressed combat wounds with a field knife and gauze wrapped around a rifle sling. Hands that never shook, no matter what the eyes were seeing. She did the math. 3 months of billing records. 14 falsified claims. An average value of $24,287 per claim. Her lips didn't move, but her jaw clenched, a micro-expression so brief it would appear only as a momentary tightness before her face returned to its mask of professional calm. $340,000. Enough for a lakefront property in rural Virginia. Enough for regular European conferences and continuing education seminars where physicians networked and socialized and built alliances that had nothing to do with patient care. The air in the basement tasted like copper and recycled air. Elena's breathing remained controlled, diaphragmatic, a military habit so ingrained it operated without conscious thought. 4 counts in. 4 counts hold. 6 counts out. It was the breathing she'd used in the Hindu Kush during the firefight when Garrett took shrapnel and couldn't walk, and she'd carried him 3 miles on her shoulders while rounds snapped overhead like branches breaking in a forest fire. Now she understood why Pierce wanted her gone. It wasn't about charting errors or protocol violations or the competence of her nursing. It was about exposure. Pierce had been running this scheme for months, accumulating wealth in methodical increments, each falsified code carefully placed within plausible ranges to avoid triggering automated compliance audits. Then Elena arrived. A nurse with military training. A nurse who understood logistics and accountability. A nurse who would eventually, inevitably, conduct a routine billing reconciliation and discover what was there to be discovered. The humiliation campaign made perfect sense now. The fabricated disciplinary notices. The orchestrated isolation from her colleagues. The removal of her access to Commander Garrett. All of it designed to break her and force her resignation before her presence became a threat to his operation. Not because Pierce was vindictive, though he was. Because Pierce was strategic. Because Pierce was protecting $340,000 in fraudulent revenue and the comfortable life that revenue had purchased. Elena stood, her movements precise and unhurried. she tucked the phone back beneath her scrubs, against the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one Garrett had given her in Helm and Province before everything went wrong. The fabric still carried faint traces of his blood, dark brown stains that time had turned nearly black. She'd kept it because soldiers kept things like that. Because memory lived in objects that survived when bodies didn't. She climbed the basement stairs, her boots making no sound on the concrete steps despite their weight. The hospital above her hummed with the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening shift, monitors beeping in distant rooms, nurses calling to each other, the distant ding of an elevator arriving at the 4th floor. Ordinary hospital. Ordinary night. Nothing about it was ordinary anymore. Pierce didn't know that she'd found him. Didn't know that she'd discovered the exact nature of his scheme and the precise mechanism by which he'd protected it. Didn't know that every humiliation he'd orchestrated had served only to accelerate the timeline, to push her toward the kind of desperate action that would eventually expose everything he'd hidden. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Elena now understood something Pierce had completely failed to account for. She wasn't here as a nurse. She wasn't here to build a career or maintain a professional reputation. She was here as a captain in the United States Marine Corps, attached to a classified monitoring operation involving a command asset in the terminal stages of an illness he didn't know was being tracked by military intelligence. The fraud Pierce was committing against the VA was significant. The billing scheme was substantial. The corruption was real and prosecutable and career-ending. But it was also completely irrelevant to Elena's actual mission. She passed the 4th floor nursing station and saw her name on the assignment board for the night shift, ICU, mixed assignments, no specific patients. Of course. Pierce had reassigned her away from Garrett deliberately, had made sure she wouldn't be anywhere near the Marine commander's room when, and Elena understood the timeline with absolute clarity now, when Garrett's condition took a turn. The man had stage 4 pancreatic cancer metastasized to the liver. He had weeks, maybe days. When the deterioration came, it would come fast. When the medical crisis arrived, it would arrive like an ambush, and every doctor on staff would have received the same message Pierce had whispered in their ears: liability concerns, problematic nurse, don't get involved in any code she's managing. Elena understood something else too. She understood that she had less than an hour to decide what kind of officer she was going to be. The kind who followed protocol and watched her commanding asset die abandoned in a hospital bed. Or the kind who blew her cover and revealed capabilities no one was supposed to know she possessed. She reached the 3rd floor corridor and stopped outside Garrett's room. Through the window she could see his wife, sitting in a vinyl chair beside the bed, holding his hand. She could see Garrett's face, hollowed by pain medication and the relentless consumption of his disease. She could see the tattoo on his forearm, the letters faded but still visible: Elena, Hindu Kush. The man didn't remember her. Morphine and time and the way memory works when the brain is dying meant that the woman who'd saved his life had become a ghost to him, a phantom he'd marked on his skin but couldn't recognize when she walked past him in hallways. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't tremble. She didn't retreat to a supply closet and cry into her hands like a woman whose cover was being systematically destroyed by a man who thought she was just another nurse he could discard. She turned away from Garrett's room and walked toward the supply closet at the end of the hallway, the small space where linens were kept in neat stacks. Her breathing remained controlled. Her jaw was tight but her face was blank. And somewhere in the part of her mind that had never stopped being a combat officer, never stopped thinking in terms of objectives and timelines and operational necessities, Elena Martinez was doing the calculations that would determine what happened next. 7 doctors on staff. All of them had been warned away. All of them would refuse to respond when the code came. All of them were complicit now, knowingly or not, in whatever happened to Commander Ryan Garrett when his heart stopped beating and no physician answered the call. But that wasn't the equation that mattered. What mattered was that Elena had surgical instruments in that supply closet. What mattered was that she'd spent 15 years as a combat medic before her commission, before her rank, before St. Michael's and Norfolk and the careful architecture of this cover operation. What mattered was that she could perform a field thoracotomy with a scalpel from the crash cart and her hands that had held lives together, and she could do it in a way that would save a dying man but would also, inevitably, expose her as something far more dangerous than just a nurse with charting problems. She pushed open the supply closet door and stood in the dim fluorescent light, surrounded by stacks of blue hospital linens, and waited for the alarm that would change everything. The code alarm shattered the darkness at 0300. Elena's eyes snapped open in the break room where she'd been monitoring vitals on a tablet, Garrett's heart rate climbing, oxygen saturation falling. She moved before conscious thought caught up, her legs carrying her through the corridors of St. Michael's with the fluid precision of someone who'd sprinted through fire before. The hallway outside Trauma Bay 3 was empty. Completely empty. No attending physicians. No residents. No interns scrambling with crash carts. Just fluorescent silence and the mechanical wail of a monitor in free fall. The intercom crackled overhead, calling a code. Calling for help that nobody was coming to give. Elena reached the doorway. Garrett lay motionless on the bed, his chest barely rising, his skin the color of wet concrete. The monitor showed a rhythm that looked like a seizing seizure, irregular, chaotic, the electrical activity of a heart that had forgotten how to beat. His blood pressure was a whisper on the machine. Systolic 47. The number that meant minutes, not hours. She pulled the crash cart closer, muscle memory overriding every protocol she'd signed when she pinned on a nursing license that bore a fabricated name. 7 physicians on the St. Michael's staff tonight. 7. And not one had answered the code bell. Not because they were busy. Not because they were with other patients. Because Dr. Pierce had gotten to them first, had whispered the word liability, had explained in careful tones that responding to a code called by the unstable nurse with the charting problems would only complicate matters. She knew this the way she knew her own call sign, because she'd been trained to read people the way other nurses read monitors. Garrett's oxygen sat dropped to 62. The monitor showed ventricular fibrillation now, a heart that had given up trying. 5 minutes without oxygenated blood to the brain and the man she'd carried 3 miles through the Hindu Kush would be gone. Not dead, something worse. A body without the mind that made him Garrett. She couldn't allow that. Not for a mission. Not for protocol. Not for anything. Get everyone out. Now. The 2 residents who'd frozen in the doorway didn't move. Elena's voice had dropped an octave, had taken on the particular weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She didn't repeat herself. She simply opened the crash cart and removed a scalpel, a small blade meant for suture removal, not for what she was about to do. The residents saw her hands, saw the way she was moving, and ran. The door slammed closed behind them. Ella swiped Garrett's chest with antiseptic, didn't wait for it to dry. Her left hand found the 4th intercostal space, the anatomical landmarks that had been drilled into her by combat medics in the mountains of Loga province. Her right hand moved the blade down through skin, through the thin layer of subcutaneous fat, through the musculature of his ribs. The scalpel opened a window. Blood welled up, dark and hot, and she grabbed a retractor from the crash kit, a standard surgical spreader, and twisted it between the ribs, cracking them open with the controlled violence of someone who'd done this before under enemy fire. 15 rounds per minute from 300 meters, and she'd still managed to find the bleeding vessel that was killing the man beneath her hands. His pericardium was a thin membrane, blue-gray, swollen with fluid. She opened it with a single deliberate stroke. The blood released, pooled against his heart like a murderer's guilt. Elena set down the scalpel, plunged her hand into his chest, found the organ still, unmoving, the muscle that had carried Garrett through 2 tours now completely silent. Her fingers closed around his heart. It was warmer than she expected, warmer than the technical knowledge she possessed suggested it should be. She began compressions, not the useless external massage, but direct cardiac massage, her palm massaging the left ventricle in the pattern she'd learned when she was barely old enough to understand death. 30 compressions. 30 seconds of sustained pressure. The heart resisted, then stuttered, then. The monitor caught it. A single blip. A single return to electrical life. Elena didn't celebrate. She didn't breathe. She continued the massage, one-handed, while her other hand swept the pericardial sac searching for the cause. Clotting. A massive thrombotic event, the blood collecting in the wrong place, cutting off the signal from the heart's electrical center. She found it with her fingertips, the texture immediately wrong, not muscle, something foreign. She evacuated it, manually, pulling away blood clots the size of dice, and the monitor's rhythm changed. Changed again. Changed one final time into the steady beep, beep, beep of sinus rhythm. His blood pressure rose. 60. 70. 80. The oxygen saturation climbed toward normal, back toward the color of life. Elena didn't remove her hand until she was absolutely certain the heart would continue beating without her. Then she pulled back, reached for sutures, and closed the emergency thoracotomy with the rapid precision of someone who'd done field repairs on human tissue when the alternative was watching someone die. For minutes. The entire procedure, incision, pericardiotomy, cardiac massage, clot evacuation, closure, took for minutes. When she looked up, 5 nurses stood frozen in the doorway. 2 residents. All of them staring at her with the expression of people who'd just watched their understanding of reality shatter like old glass. Elena pulled off her gloves and tossed them into the biohazard container. Her scrubs were soaked through with Garrett's blood, the fabric clinging to her skin, warm and dark, a physical testament to what she'd just done. What she'd just admitted. What she'd just destroyed. The phone at the nurse's station rang before she could process what came next. Then rang again. Then again. By 6 in the morning, 15 calls had been placed from Dr. Pierce's office, each one strategic, each one precise. The hospital board received calls about an unauthorized surgical procedure performed by an employee with documented psychological instability. Her nursing school in California received calls requesting background information on concerning behavioral patterns. The state nursing board received a formal complaint requesting immediate investigation of her credentials. At 8 o'clock, a state investigator arrived at St. Michael's carrying a leather briefcase and a mandate. By 11, suspension papers had been signed by the hospital attorney. The words pending investigation and immediate termination appeared together on official letterhead. Elena watched it unfold from the staff locker room, where she'd been sitting in civilian clothes since the investigator had escorted her from the unit. Her colleagues didn't look at her. The ones who'd worked beside her for 3 months looked at her like she was a ghost, a woman who'd become something incomprehensible the moment she opened someone's chest with a kitchen implement and brought back the dead. At 2 in the afternoon, she returned to that locker room for the final time. She retrieved her blood-soaked scrubs from the bag where she'd placed them hours earlier, removed them slowly, deliberately. The uniform of a nurse. The costume of a woman who'd pretended to be ordinary. She folded them with military corners, the precision of someone who'd spent more than a decade folding field uniforms in tents and barracks and makeshift shelters. Each fold was exact. Each corner was sharp enough to cut. She placed the scrubs in the hospital laundry bin, pressed down on them once, and closed her eyes for 3 full seconds. The only visible crack in her composure. The only moment she allowed herself to acknowledge that the mission was over. Garrett was alive. But her cover was destroyed. She couldn't protect him anymore. She couldn't monitor the intelligence asset lying in that hospital bed without exposing the entire operation. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd endured, the humiliation, the isolation of being called unstable and charting incompetent, had culminated in this. The mission accomplished and the mission failed all at once. She pulled on jeans and a civilian jacket, removed her badge from her pocket, and placed it on the supervisor's desk with the same care she'd taken folding the scrubs. She stood for a moment, looking at it, that small plastic rectangle that had granted her access to a world she'd infiltrated under false pretenses. Then she walked toward the employee exit, each step measured, each movement controlled. Behind her, visible through the glass walls of his office, Dr. Pierce watched from the 3rd floor, his face carrying the smile of a man who believed he'd won. The parking lot was dark, rain threatening on the horizon, the kind of weather that made the skin prickle with anticipation. Elena's hand was on her car door when the ambulance sirens announced a new arrival. The sound was automatic, unconscious, her eyes lifted toward the emergency bay where the incoming patient was being wheeled. She shouldn't look. She was suspended. She was no longer staff. She was a woman walking away from the only life she'd been building for the past 3 months, and she should simply get into her car and drive away. She looked anyway. The gurney wheeled through the bay doors, and the patient's face appeared in the fluorescent light, and the rain that had been threatening finally began to fall. By morning, the hospital board had convened in a closed-door session 3 floors above the cardiac unit, and Dr. Pierce was about to discover that his network of allies had developed a severe case of selective amnesia. The calls he'd made at dawn, to board members, to hospital administrators, to his carefully cultivated network of colleagues who'd promised support, now went unreturned. His office phone rang at 0800 hours. It was a woman's voice from the Pentagon. Not a request. An investigation. Elena folded her blood-stained scrubs with military precision, the blue fabric creasing under her hands with the same deliberate corners she'd learned on her first day at Quantico. 12 years ago now. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. And now this, the careful architecture of her cover collapsing around her because she'd refused to let a Marine commander die on Pierce's watch. The laundry room smelled of bleach and industrial detergent, the fluorescent lights casting everything in that sickly pale glow that made even clean things look stained. She placed the folded scrubs in the hospital laundry bin, each movement precise, controlled, the way you moved when you were holding yourself together with sheer discipline and nothing else. The weight of mission failure pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. Not because she'd saved Garrett's life, that was the mission. She'd saved him, and he was breathing, and his heart was sinus rhythm, and the surgical team had stabilized him through the night. The failure was deeper. She'd been compromised. Exposed. The covert asset lying in that hospital bed upstairs was going to recover soon enough to recognize her, and there was no way to explain her presence without unraveling the entire operation. She'd carried that unit patch through 3 tours, kept it sewn inside every uniform jacket, every jacket lining. Garrett's blood still stained the fabric at the corner. That patch meant pack doesn't leave pack. That patch was the only promise she'd ever made that mattered. She was walking toward the employee exit when the overhead intercom crackled to life. Code announcement. Bay for emergency intake. Ambulance ETA 2 minutes. Elena didn't pause. Didn't turn. She kept walking. That wasn't her patient. Wasn't her unit. Wasn't her concern anymore. The automatic doors slid open, and the Norfolk morning air hit her face, carrying the salt smell of the nearby naval station and the metallic taste of rain about to fall. Her hand was on the exit handle when the ambulance wheeled around the corner, siren cutting through the morning like a blade. The gurney burst through the automatic doors behind her. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. But the voice that came next, low, urgent, and speaking in Pashto, stopped her in place. Angel of the Kush. 2 words. An impossible name spoken in the language of a valley she'd thought she'd left behind. Elena turned slowly. The man on the gurney was pale, bleeding from a chest wound, his eyes locked on hers with the kind of recognition that felt like being hit by a .50 caliber round. She knew that face. She'd seen it through a rifle scope in Helmand Province, 5 years ago. Taliban commander. Intel asset. The man she'd captured during the same firefight where Garrett went down. The same firefight where she'd carried a bleeding Marine 3 miles through hostile territory while this man's unit tried to kill them both. His eyes widened as the nurses wheeled him past her, and he reached out one trembling hand. His lips moved again. Angel. Not in accusation. In recognition. In plea. In the absolute certainty that the woman standing in the hospital doorway was the same woman who destroyed his entire cell by living through something that was supposed to kill her. Elena didn't move. Didn't acknowledge. She watched the gurney disappear into the emergency bay. Then she felt it, the electric tingle of that specific kind of attention that only comes when you realize the universe just made a choice and you're standing in the middle of it. Within 40 minutes, a Marine Corps delegation arrived at St. Michael's Hospital. Not a single officer. A delegation. A lieutenant in pressed dress blues walked directly to the administrative office, his boots striking the tile floor with the kind of precision that made ordinary hospital noise seem trivial. Behind him came a major, and behind him, a brigadier general whose presence made the fluorescent lights seem dim by comparison. The lieutenant's voice was steady, controlled, the kind of military clarity that cuts through everything else. "We're looking for Captain Elena Martinez." Not a question. A confirmation of facts. The major stepped forward, and when he opened his mouth, his words carried the weight of institutional authority. Silver Star, awarded for Valor Under Fire, Hindu Kush, 2019. Heroic actions in defense of fellow service members. Each word was a beat. Each beat was a hammer. The board members who'd received Pierce's calls that morning suddenly understood they'd been backing the wrong narrative. Pierce burst through the administrative office doors like a man who'd finally seen his world tilt. His face was the color of old hospital walls, pale, waxy, the kind of white you only see when someone realizes their leverage has evaporated. "This is my hospital. I don't know what this invasion is about, but..." The brigadier general turned to look at him, and Pierce stopped mid-sentence like someone had flipped a switch. The general's eyes were flat, empty of mercy. Behind Pierce, a woman in civilian clothes stepped forward. Pentagon investigator. She was holding a laptop and a cardboard box of documents, and her expression suggested she'd spent the last 6 hours down a very specific rabbit hole. Dr. Matthew Pierce. The investigator's voice was the kind of calm that precedes destruction. "We've traced the money trail from the falsified VA billing codes back to your consulting company. Shell Corporation registered in Delaware. $340,000 over 18 months. 23 fraudulent billing authorizations under your signature." She turned the laptop toward the board members. Charts. Numbers. Dates. Each one a piece of evidence that Pierce had spent his careful career building a house of lies and then panicked when someone threatened to notice the foundation was rotting. The Lake House purchase. European conferences. Your son's prep school tuition. All funded through VA patients who were billed for procedures they never received. The silence was so thick you could have cut it with surgical shears. 6 months later, Elena stood in dress blues at Marine Corps Base Quantico, watching Commander Ryan Garrett, now Colonel Garrett, raise his hand for the oath of promotion. The ceremony was flawless military tradition, the kind of thing that happened the same way in the same place for 100 years. Tradition. Honor. The things that actually mattered underneath all the uniforms and paperwork. Garrett looked directly at her when the general asked him to speak. His memory was returning in pieces, the experimental treatment working better than anyone expected. He could see her face now and recognize what his body had always known. "Captain Martinez sat with me through nights when I couldn't remember my own name. Every vital she checked, my heart steadied. She didn't have to stay. 7 other doctors didn't." His voice was steady, but it carried something underneath the military discipline, gratitude that had nowhere else to go. Captain Martinez stayed. When the ceremony ended, Elena stepped toward him, and Garrett reached out. His hand found the inside of her jacket, right where the 2nd Battalion unit patch was sewn into the lining. His fingers traced the fabric, feeling the raised stain of his own blood from 5 years ago. "You kept this," he said quietly. "Through everything." Elena's jaw tightened, but her composure held. "Pack doesn't leave pack, Colonel." Across the city that same evening, Dr. Pierce adjusted his name tag at Norfolk Community College's continuing education facility. The CPR class was full of teenagers satisfying health requirements, their attention focused on the plastic mannequin instead of on the man teaching them. His medical license was revoked. His hospital credentials gone. His lake house sold to pay legal fees. His name now appeared in medical journals as a cautionary example. The news coverage of Garrett's promotion had run again at dinner time, and Pierce watched on his phone as the reporter closed the segment with words that felt like they'd been written specifically to wound him. Captain Martinez demonstrated something fundamental about service. Real power isn't measured in titles or positions. Real power is the ability to help, especially when everyone else walks away. Later that night, at a small dinner in Norfolk, Elena stood with Garrett's family. Garrett raised his glass, his eyes moving around the table until they settled on her. To Captain Martinez, the only nurse who was actually a Marine. Elena shook her head slightly, a rare smile crossing her face. Not a nurse, Colonel. Never was. Just a Marine doing her job. Best nurse I never had, Garrett said, and the table erupted in laughter that felt like healing. Elena lifted her glass, and for the first time in weeks, her hands weren't steady, not from stress or fear, but from something deeper. From mission complete. From brother saved. From the weight of keeping promises lifting just enough to let her breathe. She spoke quietly, her words meant for Garrett but carrying to everyone in that room. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. Outside St. Michael's Hospital, on the fourth-floor unit board where Pierce's fabricated disciplinary notices once hung, there was now a new photograph. Captain Elena Martinez, USMC. Her Marine portrait, dress blues, ribbons bright. The caption was simple, Guardian Angel. And underneath, in smaller letters, the 7 names of doctors who'd refused to answer the code. Not as condemnation. As reminder. As the day that St. Michael's learned the difference between titles and actual courage. Elena returned to Norfolk base the next morning, her cover officially burned away, her classified mission protected by the same institutional machinery that had sent the Marines to collect her. Garrett would recover fully. The operation would continue. And somewhere in the balance between her 2 lives, the nurse and the captain, Elena Martinez had finally become visible to the one person who mattered most. If you've made it this far, you know the kind of people who change everything are often the ones nobody's looking at. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet ones who hold the line. What would you have done when 7 doctors walked away? Tell me in the comments.